Welcome to Close Listening. I'm Zach Morgenstern, joined as always by silent co-host Ludwig von B. And here's a little thought. You ever notice that Britain's biggest rock musicians tend to be bands, and North America's tend to be solo artists? Why is that? Now, sadly, I'm just some puts on the internet, so I can't give you a great answer. What I can do, though, is speculate on theories that I and others in similar positions have come up with to the question. So one thought that people, I think, tend to have in that discussion is saying vaguely, well, Britain is more of a collectivist society than America. And as I reflect on this theory, what I'm tempted to say is I'd be willing to accept it only if the right intellectual laid it out. Because on a certain level, I think it's oversimplistic. This notion that America is a society of rugged individuals who unequivocally hate more collective projects, I feel like that's something that was sold to us really hard by Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. But, a lot of iconic rock and roll came before Ronald Reagan. It came, just after Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal. And it was going on when Kennedy said, "Think not what your country can do for you, but you can do for your country." And then Lyndon Johnson went on to build the Great Society. And granted, Britain might seem like the far more collectivist society today, if only that they have the NHS, and America does not have universal health care, and Britain's universities are still comparatively more affordable than America's, though it's certainly not what it used to be. But Britain has kind of followed a similar sociological trajectory to America. So when America got Reagan playing up the individualism, Britain got Margaret Thatcher saying there's no such thing as society and bashing the trade unions. And then immediately after Thatcher and Reagan, the so-called left-wing parties in America and Britain also turned to right, with the Americans getting Bill Clinton and Britain getting Tony Blair. So I guess this notion that America is, super individualistic and Britain is more collectivist, it's closer to socialism in spirit, I guess I just don't buy it, because I feel like it's partially rooted in a kind of anti-Americanism, where all the other capitalist countries of the world that have similar problems to America like to exaggerate how different they are from America to make those ills seem like an American problem rather than. Now, a slightly more specific version of the American society versus British society theory might be that it comes down to, for whatever reason, Britain's great bands came from cities, Liverpool, Manchester, and London. And thinking from that Marxist perspective, cities bring people together, and factories, people are tightly knit. They develop a collective consciousness that now maybe that produces more bands. Now, when it comes to America, Elvis was born in Tupelo, Mississippi, though he was discovered in Memphis, so a mixed product of city and the country. Chuck Berry was from St. Louis. Fats Domino was from New Orleans. But I don't know, you'd have to go through a long list of names. You'd have to decide what Gary, Indiana, or Michael Jackson is from. Is more like Bob Dylan was from Duluth, Minnesota. Bo Diddley, another of the early rock gods, was from Macomb, Mississippi. So certainly wasn't developing an urban proletarian consciousness there either. But I think safer than any of these sort of grand sociological country or locale specific explanations is just to look at the way rock and roll's history coincidentally played out. I specifically want to focus in on rock having founding moments, and those founding moments cementing certain traditions into place. So a related question to this one is the question of what is rock and roll? A lot of people fall on the spectrum of just defining rock and roll as sort of any music that came after jazz, anything that came from the 1950s onwards. If you look at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, they're inducting rappers now. Tupac Shakur is in there. They have folk singers who were never really considered rockers in their time, like Joan Baez. They have ABBA, who historically were derided as pop, and pop was assumed not to be rock, even though there's not really a coherent difference. At the same time, if you go to a certain kind of guitar shop, or you watch a Jack Black movie like School of Rock or The Pick of Destiny, you get a far narrower sense of what counts as rock. Namely, guys with really loud electric guitars and wild hair and wild face paint. That said, that's even within the realm of what is basically considered rock and roll, there were multiple founding moments, and they gave birth on this musical tree to different interpretations of the genre of music. So when does rock and roll's first founding moment come from? Well, if you're thinking specifically of rock and roll as a popularly understood musical genre, You'd probably go to 1954 when Elvis records his single version of Arthur Crudup, a black blues singer song, That's All Right Mama, and Bill Monroe, a white bluegrass singer song, Blue Moon of Kentucky. At this moment, the hyper-segregated world of music went, what? Genre is largely aligned. Both country and blues are basically just two different speeds of the same thing, and both could sound equally good, played in an upbeat rock and roll rhythm. So this version of rock and roll inspired a generation of young teenagers, including Johnny Lennon and Michael Jagger. They realized, you don't have to be some great saxophone, jazz virtuoso, or classical piano virtuoso. Music is something that you could learn if you just listened to it and figured out a few basic patterns. It could be fast and energetic and fun. All you needed was a guitar and a willingness to sing. So in other words, when rock and roll is invented, it's a democratizing moment in music history. It says music is not just for those who attend musical academies. It is something you can do. And so it's no surprise this American trend eventually comes to Britain. And just as America had its huge rock star in Elvis, Britain had its huge rock star in Lonnie Donegan. Lonnie Donegan was a contemporary of Elvis's, and his musical style came to be called skiffle. So, like Elvis, he played songs of the old American South. Unlike Elvis, his skiffle band went even more into the roots of music. So, Lonnie Donegan was primarily a banjo player. But more importantly,
The skiffle sound came to be understood as including
two homespun instruments, the washboard for rhythm and the tea-chest bass. So rock and roll, even from that moment of Elvis, democratized music. Again, you didn't have to be a great musical virtuoso. You just needed some chutzpah and the ability to play ADE on your guitar. But skiffle took that democratization one step forward. So you have a teenage John Lennon listening to Lonnie Donegan, and he's able to ask his friends, Pete Shotton, Nigel Wally, Ivan Vaughn, and Bill Smith, who don't necessarily have the same musical ambitions or talents, to just come hang out and play in his band. And all they have to do is bring a washboard or learn, with not too much difficulty, how to make a few notes on a one-string homemade bass. And so ultimately, why does America end up with the cult of individuals and Britain ends up with the cult of bands? Well, record executives and aspiring musicians are going to look to the role model that they have. So in America, that's obviously Elvis. And Britain has its moment with Lonnie Donegan, but then Lonnie Donegan inspires the Beatles, and basically the Beatles become so iconic, they supplant Lonnie Donegan in the British musical consciousness. Now, it's possible to conceive of a world where John Lennon becomes the next Lonnie Donegan, and his skiffle friends just become his unknown backup band. So rather than the Beatles, we have John Lennon and the Quarrymen. But then Paul McCartney joins this skiffle band, and Paul McCartney is John's equal in talent, maybe even a little more talented. So suddenly the possibility that this band could ever be marketed as John and his backup band or John and the Quarrymen becomes impossible. The sort of historical coincidence of these two musical talents meaning forever they will have a collective identity. One final point to explain, why history did not quite go the same for John or Paul than it did for Elvis is, Elvis essentially made it because he had a top tier singing voice. All he had to do was walking into a studio and open his mouth, and wow. John Lennon and Paul McCartney, certainly good singers, and Paul McCartney, arguably trained his voice to become a top tier singer. But at least at the beginning, they were not Elvis level singers. So this forced them to achieve fame in a different way. They were not naturally anointed as kings, but rather had to come up with a project that they could pitch as kings. So they had to write their songs together and convince the world that their songs were the next great thing. So to summarize where we've gone so far, rock and roll democratizes music. But this first moment of democratization, Elvis is only sort of democratizing because, well, he's the king. A king was crowned, and the crowning of a king is antithetical to democracy. They say kings were chosen by God, and Elvis was chosen by God to have an amazing voice. So the Beatles represent the first attempt to democratize democracy. And the way I see it, since the Beatles, musicians have asked further questions about how to further democratize the music tradition. So you have Elvis setting the sort of model for what an American rock star will look like. And you have the Beatles setting a model for what the British rock star could look like. Now, you could imagine a world where, because the Beatles are newer than Elvis, they become the model for both Britain and America. But that doesn't happen. When one looks at Elvis's earliest recordings, you can synthesize a couple separate parts. On the one hand, you could synthesize Elvis himself, the charismatic singer playing simple acoustic guitar chords. Or you could synthesize more of a focus on the musical sound. You have Bill Black playing double bass on the background of Elvis's songs. And more importantly, you have Scotty Moore playing the lead guitar parts, not on acoustic, but on electric guitar. So one trend that comes after Elvis and the Beatles is to emulate the charismatic singer and simple acoustic guitar part of the American singer. But then democratizing impulse says charismatic singer doesn't have to be virtuoso singer. You get Bobby Dylan. And suddenly American rock and roll has two founding moments. You have Elvis, the first democratizer of music, and then you have Dylan, who democratizes music even further by saying it's not about being anointed with a great voice, it's about coming up with ideas for great songs. And what this leads to is one branch in the musical family tree, the branch that eventually produces the singer-songwriters who don't meet the sort of Jack Black guitar shop definition of rock and roll, but certainly meet the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame definition of rock and roll. In Britain, meanwhile, because there's already the role model of the band, the Beatles, you see more of a focus not on the charismatic singer, but on Scotty Moore and the electric guitar. So the electric guitar was always an important part of British rock culture, dating back to early instrumental groups like the Shadows. But eventually this focus on the guitar leads to a harder and harder rock sound. The Stones rocked harder than the Beatles. Sabbath and Zeppelin rocked harder than the Stones. And it's important to recognize that the rise of hard rock was also, in a way, a democratic impulse. While some singers like Bob Dylan, Jimi Hendrix, and Lou Reed says, it doesn't matter if I can sing like Elvis, the other side of rock culture said, singing shouldn't be central to what's considered rock and roll, period. Because singing, it's inherently kind of undemocratic. It's more of a natural talent thing. Whereas any kid who, I guess is able to get their hands on a guitar and is able to play it in their bedroom and practice chords and solos, eventually they can learn to shred. Eventually, they can fake their way to being some kind of guitar hero. So in short, rock and roll is this tradition of democratizing. And the way I see it, rock and roll has sort of four crucial founding moments. One happens in America, one happens in Britain, and the next two, the second one to happen in America, Bobby Dylan, and the second one to happen in Britain, kind of Black Sabbath, Led Zeppelin, they're both emulating the first democratizing moment in America and Britain, respectively. And as a result, you get an entrenched culture in the American music industry of solo artists, and you get an entrenched culture in the British music industry of band artists. Now, that said, there are, of course, plenty of exceptions to the rule. And just because the sort of most memory accessible acts represent this trend, it doesn't mean if one were to actually look at the data, it would be as clear. I don't know for sure if America really has more solo artists, especially these days, than Britain, or it just has to do with who got to be famous. One thing I was thinking about when making this video is Britain has two huge exceptions to this trend in David Bowie and Elton John. When you think about both of them, what you realize is both of them were LGBT. So their very existence in the time when they were coming up was about deviating from the British mold. So if you were to predict any artist to sort of not follow the band trend, it would have to be them. But I'd be curious to hear, do you have any other theories as to why Britain seems to be associated with bands and America seems to be associated with solo artists? How one applies this theory to artists from like rock's second generation who tried to sort of be both at once, Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band and Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers in America, or Elvis Costello and the Attraction in Britain. I'm sure there's a lot of interesting ways to think about it. The one frustrating thing is that it all kind of comes down to speculation. I'm Zach Morgenstern. This is silent co-host Ludwig von B. See you next time.